60 frames a second in 12K, which is madness. So I wanted to make this video really quick out of the gate because I have thoughts on this. This is just on my iPhone 11 and a little Rode mic into it so we can get some decent-ish audio. But I wanted to respond to this super quick. Now, Blackmagic had a camera announcement coming up. You never quite know with Blackmagic what that's going to be. It could be an update to firmware because they do update the firmware fairly regularly. They will roll out stuff like Blackmagic RAW and enable that on various cameras. So it could have been something like that. But I was chatting with the team beforehand and we couldn't really think of anything which needed updating in the current lineup of cameras. So looking through everything, everything's pretty unified now. They've all got Blackmagic RAW. All of the firmware's been updated to the A10 Pros. So the pockets, the 6K and the 4K will interact with that nicely. So we couldn't see there would be a firmware update. And sure enough, low key as ever, at about 1:30 in the morning Australia time, Grant is announcing this, and he's just kind of saying, oh, and we zoom out from 4K to 6K, and we're thinking, okay, 6K, that's pocket 6K. 8K, it's like, oh wow, okay, this is something. And then 12K, I initially thought, as did a couple of the guys, that it was actually something to do with Resolve and the way you could work in timelines rather than a new camera at that point. But then he just gets out this URSA and 12K, there you have it. Now immediately I thought, okay, 12K, that's something, that's a statement, but how high can we go with the frame rate? 60 frames a second in 12K, which is madness. And for anyone who hasn't done the maths on that, that's like over 80 megapixels. 60 frames continuous 80 megapixel images, which just blew all of our minds, including the photography team. The photography team just had like permanent surprise Pikachu face looking through this because they're looking at it thinking, oh my god, that is higher resolution than every camera we've got in our lineup, and it does more frames per second than any of the cameras, even though like the 1DX Mark II that they've got, that's got a machine gun shutter, but it's nothing on 60 frames a second at 80 megapixels. But as I'm watching this thinking, how does it fit into my workflow? Because sometimes I might go on a project and it doesn't warrant shooting at 12K. And the downside on a lot of cameras I've seen when you're doing a raw sensor readout is that you have to get the full sensor, you have to record at the native resolution of the sensor. So in this instance, I was thinking that you'd have to shoot at 12K if you wanted a Super 35 image out of it, and then you would crop in to get to 4K or 6K or whatever other resolution you wanted. But it turns out that's not the case. They're doing some really specific stuff with the sensor and interpreting how you actually read out the data from it, so they're super sampling everything. So that means you can use the full sensor, but you can record at a lower resolution. Now that makes it really useful because on some projects you might want to bump down to 6K or 8K or whatever flavor you're thinking is going to work best for you just there. And you can do that. So in terms of a camera, that makes it a lot more flexible. And we might be in the situation where we actually have an URSA Pro and a couple of G2s and a Pocket 6K, so we could choose a different camera if we wanted to. But if you're thinking about just having one camera, if you're always committed to that sensor resolution to get your full width, that can actually be a real burden. But not so with this, which is great news because I think that that just shows they're looking at it in practical terms as well as the headline specs of 12K. It's like, okay, but how do people use it day to day? Maybe we need to work this in, and they've done that straight out of the gate as well. It's not like a firmware update down the line. This is something they're coming out with to the market straight away, which is awesome. So we're topping out at 60 frames a second in 12K, mind blown, but then we also have some other really high resolutions. I think we go up to 110 frames per second in 8K, and then 4K you're at 220. Let's just scroll down. Yeah, so that's 220 frames at 4K. Now all the current lineup of URSAs don't go to that higher resolution at that frame rate, but when you do the higher frame rates here, you are going to crop into the sensor. That's something that we have seen on the previous models as well. So on the URSA G2, you could get to 300 frames per second, but you needed to crop into basically Super 16. On this, you can get 4K, 220 frames per second, and that's going to be basically Super 16. The 8K, I believe, sits somewhere in between, but this is all absolutely crazy, and there was no hint that Blackmagic were going to be launching this. We've got some new color science coming, and as Grant mentioned, that's going to be rolling out across some of the other cameras as well, so this won't be exclusive to the new URSA 12K. It will be filtering down. I expect to see that in the G2, probably the Pro, and definitely in the 6K and probably the 4K as well. So we'll eventually, as the firmware updates roll out, get a unifying of the new color science. The rationale they gave for the color science change was all of the previous iterations had been focused on more the ProRes side of things that they were doing when they were doing the log profiles, that kind of stuff. rather than what they can do with Blackmagic RAW. So the new Color Science version 5 is going to be more tailored towards what you can do with the Blackmagic RAW files, which is nice. You know, they're just enhancing everything, and that'll trickle down through the rest of the camera lineup. And it's always nice when you can have one of your older cameras get that little boost and then unify, so that if you are using new cameras and old cameras on projects, you still have a unified color science behind it. That's particularly important for us where we do use multiple camera systems, just being able to switch between them and not worry that one is on an older iteration of color science and we'll have to do a little bit of work matching it. We get that no matter what. I can't think of many other brands that give you so many options for how you actually record. So same as on the URSAs, you've got SD cards, you've got CFast cards, you have the USB-C out, which has now been slightly tweaked. They've added a little screw port and giving you a locking option on that USB-C cable. And you've also got the SSD recorder, which bolts onto the back. New version for this camera, and it has some new options on the SSD drives that actually go into it. So there's the standard sort of 2.5-inch style, but then there's also the computer specific ones which you plug straight into a motherboard. So it's nice to have all of those options, and it means that you can be recording at these high data rates but have a very cost-effective way of getting hold of your storage. And it means that perhaps you're not tying yourself into the more expensive CFast cards, where you can use SSDs if you want with the new locking ports, but also the backplate there that takes those bare drives is an option, and it's pretty cheap. I think it was about £350-ish, which is really not that bad when you're looking at this and thinking, well, you can get some much cheaper storage that integrates into the body and is super fast as well. Grant looked at some other things that were really impressive, like how Resolve is going to deal with 12K, and he played back multiple streams of 12K and showed how it can be efficiently worked with that Blackmagic RAW. Obviously you are going to be looking at higher data rates, and it's yet to be seen how lesser systems will cope with that, but I think given our experience with how Blackmagic RAW plays just with laptop setups, this shouldn't be too bad as long as you have a relatively serious system to deal with, in which case I don't think it's going to be an issue for most people, because this is a pretty specialist camera when you look at it, and I don't imagine that lots of people with really small computers and not serious grading setups are going to be going out and shooting reams and reams of 12K footage. If you are, that is pretty much on your head. But I think that Blackmagic RAW is a codec which is capable, and if you are looking at the lower data rate, and certainly for the 8K, you probably cope with that on most systems that are out there these days without too much sweat. You may want to work with lower proxy resolutions or that kind of thing, but they're taking that into account and they're trying to make Resolve as efficient as possible, which is great to hear. All that other good stuff is still in there. We've still got the built-in NDs, that hasn't changed. It's coming in PL mount, but you'll also have options for EF mount as well. The other thing to address here is that Blackmagic have stuck with this URSA body shape since the 4.6K and the 4K original URSAs. I say original URSAs, original URSA minis, not the giant original URSA. So that's the 4K, the 4.6K, then we had the Pro, we've got the G2s now, and this 12K. They've stuck with the same body shape. They made some modifications, the biggest of which was the standard 4.6K to the Pro, where they added obviously those ND filters built in, changed the screen a little bit, added some buttons, moved some things around, generally made it a little bit more functional from the outside with the addition of little buttons to flick ISO, white balance, shutter speed, all of that. That stays in the 12K. So this means that if you are used to using those cameras, everything's going to be the same, which is really good if you are in a production company and you are looking to slot something into your workflow. It balances basically the same on any of your gimbals. It integrates the same in terms of plugging it in, all the rest of it, operating it's going to be very similar. So I actually quite like it when camera companies stick with a format. And it's what we've seen with DSLRs actually as well. Companies will tend to stick with their button placements and people will get very used to it. So if you are a Canon shooter, you get very used to where Canon position the buttons and how they allow you to move things around. Same for Nikon or any other camera manufacturer, Sony for example. All of those still shooters get very used to the systems they work with. On the video side, Blackmagic sticking with this body shape is much more preferable for me rather than going with a completely new one, because it means that we don't have to come up with all kinds of new systems for working things. We can still use exactly the same rigs we were building. We can still balance things up the same. We are slotting this perfectly into our workflow. It just means that it's going to be a seamless transition. And apart from all of the back end, the data rates, that kind of stuff, we don't have to change anything. We can just jump straight on this camera when it's available. So that's an overview of what's coming. We are going to get our hands on this as quickly as we possibly can. There are a few shoots that I'd really like to try it out on. Things where it might really be relevant to shoot 12K, but I'm also curious to see how the sensor reacts now, because we've been very happy with the 4.6K sensors in all of the previous URSAs. We haven't really found them wanting. But having that extra resolution, bringing it down in size and using that more as an oversampling to get a really nice 4K image, or even a really nice 6K image out of the 12K, I think is very appealing. And anything that just makes it look a little bit classier, gives you nicer highlight roll off, giving you all that lovely depth and meaning you can push in a little bit if you want to. It's rare that we'll do a big adjustment in post to reframe something, but occasionally we just push in or stabilize or maybe edge something over a little bit where we're dealing with imperfect circumstances. David Fincher style, you know, we're just honing everything a bit and having that higher resolution. We've done it with the 4.6K, we've done it with the 6K. Obviously this is going to give us even more options if we chose to go that route. And not forgetting those high frame rates. I can't wait to get this on some automotive shoots because I think this will be absolutely amazing when we're doing some really fast rig stuff. And we know we have a new horse video that we've got to shoot. So we're going to have even more drama, even more craziness, and that is going to be a lot of fun. I'm hoping that is an email from Blackmagic now saying that they are ready to ship one out to us. Thanks for watching. Apologies for the iPhone quality footage. I just wanted to get this one out quick. So yeah, thank you for bearing with that.